Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football Dill, Ohio State, Oregon, Rose Bowl. As a college football fan, it doesn't get much better. And like this year, this is the game that I'm looking forward to the most. I could say the same thing 2 months ago when these two teams played in Eugene, Oregon. I'm very vocal that these are the two best teams in the country. Whoever wins this football game will be my pick to win the national championship. We talked about this game, I believe, on Sunday afternoon and kind of just got into some loose matchups that we're looking at. This game deserves a deep dive, and we're going to get into a couple of different things. Anytime you're talking about a football game that includes just so many pros and difference makers on both sides of the football, really all over the field, there's a lot of different angles you can get into. We're going to go four different things. One, it starts with the Jimmies and Joes, right? What is the most important personnel matchup that we're going to see in this football game? Number two, the biggest question mark we have for both of these teams. Number three, my favorite, the most important stat line. Hey, cover up the scoreboard. Tell me who wins this stat. I'll tell you who won the game. And then the X factor. And that might be my second favorite, maybe my first, where look, the broadcast, the national media, they're going to talk about, 5 to 10 players in this football game a lot. Well, the truth is there's a lot of good players in this game. And some of those guys that are not being covered by the national media and the broadcast, they're going to play really big roles in this football game. Which guys are going to be the X factor for both of these teams? Without further ado, Dill, I'm going to kick it off to you. Let's get into the biggest matchup from a Jimmy's and Joe standpoint, personnel standpoint. If you're an Ohio State fan, what are you looking at the most?
It's got to be what this defensive line can do with a second crack at the Oregon offensive line that, to be quite frank, I thought thoroughly dominated that first
Yeah.
match. And I look at how talented Ohio State's defensive line is, that just can't happen. And I'll give you one really underrated thing I think to look at in this game is how they distribute snap counts. Because I look at that first game, I mean, JTT and Jack Sawyer got 57 and 60 reps or snaps in that first game of pop. They really weren't playing their backups a whole lot. I look at that Tennessee game, 43 and 39 snaps for Sawyer and JTT. I think the fact that you have guys like Melton, like Kenyatta Jackson, who I think has first round potential in terms of what he can do, a guy like Caden Curry, when you're as deep as Ohio State is, I think you do need to do a much better job distributing snaps around so that you can get Jack Sawyer playing the way he played against Tennessee, where again, you talk about domination. They really tore that Tennessee team up. So to me, it's a talented enough unit. We know there's really good players on Ohio State's defense. Can they again, almost loosen up?
Can they impact the game is where I'm going with it. And I think you're right on. You look at the first matchup, 0 sacks, 2 tackles for a loss for an Ohio State front that you said it best has a ton of NFL dudes. That's not good enough. And the box score didn't really even tell the full story. I mean, you go watch that game back and just say, where's the defensive line impacting Dylan Gabriel? Where's the defensive line creating some negative plays to put Oregon in those second and third and longs, which is a really important metric to look at. The Oregon fans know this more than anybody. Like, you look at when Oregon has struggled, it's when they get behind the chains, when they're taking penalties or taking negative plays, and that playbook on second and third down shrinks a little bit. Can you get them in that sense in this football game is a massive storyline for Ohio State.
Because I don't want to pretend Ohio State's defensive line was quote bad against Oregon. Oregon's offensive line's up there with anyone in the country, led by 2 tackles who might both go first round.
That's a popcorn matchup. I mean,
you got great players, but that to me, we talk about it, really good units on the defensive line are able to rotate guys through. I think Ohio State's players are good enough to be rotated through a little bit more and let them individually have a higher impact on this game. To me, it's if the coaches can almost let go of the reins and take a little pressure off themselves of if they make the wrong choice, take Sawyer out, they're going to get crucified. It's you just need to distribute the snaps a little bit more efficiently in my mind, because at the end of the day, it's hard to rush the passer against really good tackles down after down after down. You keep your guys fresh, I think you'll get a much better version.
I mean, Ohio State's one of the few teams with that privilege where you can rotate guys and not really have a drop off. And trust me, it's probably hard for this defensive staff to take JTT and Jack Sawyer off the football field. But when you have a guy like Kenyatta Jackson, a guy like Caden Curry, you can feel better about it. My biggest matchup, and this is by far for me Evan Stewart versus Denzel Burke, Davison Ignosin. I don't really care who it is. Those boundary cornerbacks, that's where this game came down to in their first matchup, right? Ohio State came in with the game plan, which I would expect them to replicate, and that is we're taking away Tez Johnson. We're going to use our safeties to do so. When you want to do that, this is what makes this Oregon team so difficult to deal with. You're given a one-on-one match with Evan Stewart on the outside. Evan Stewart won that matchup handily against Denzel Burke. Can you win some more of those if you're Ohio State? I mean, again, I don't think Oregon wins that football game without some of the plays Evan Stewart made working vertically down the field.
And I think you're right. Like, why wouldn't Ohio State try to first take Tez Johnson out the game?
Yeah, I think you do so.
When you play an Oregon team, that's always priority one, because when they're on and they're just like kind of playing pitch and catch, that's a defense. Like, that just feels too easy. Like, that can't be what happens for this Ohio State team. They obviously have the personnel, especially with a guy like Caleb Downs, to take him out of the game to an extent. Obviously, you're not going to totally shut him out, but you got to make him make big plays in tough plays down the field to the boundary. You're right, though. The corners just need to play better football. Like, they were really rough in that game.
I think you made a really good point, too. Where's Dylan Gabriel the best? He's best work in the middle. I mean, when he's going opposite hash to the boundary, he can get himself in some trouble. And you've seen him throw some interceptions in those circumstances. Okay, can you win the matchup against Evan Stewart out on the boundary? Really big storyline. All right, the biggest question for me, if I'm an Oregon fan, it's the perimeter. Whether it's in the run game, whether it's in the passing attack. And for whatever reason, Ohio State fans, I know you've heard this, so I'm going to keep it short. Ryan Day, Chip Kelly, for whatever reason, wanted to try to win that game with their offensive line versus the Michigan defensive line. I'm referring to that Michigan-Ohio State game. Obviously, it was a disaster. In Tennessee's game, you go and say, all right, we're going to lean into our best football players on the field. And that is the guys on the outside. That's our running backs playing in space. Much more action, whether it's in the run game with some stretch zone, whether it's some quick game to the perimeter in the passing attack. Hey, we're going to get our football to the best players on the field and let them go to work. And why I think this is so important, Dill, is one, I think Derek Carmen and Jamari Caldwell, it doesn't get much harder to run right at those big dogs. Number two, Dill, you look at what Oregon struggled with against Penn State. It was the perimeter stuff as well. I mean, Drew Aller with the threat to run the football was freezing these backside edges, was freezing
I was
these
really
linebackers.
surprised that, like, again, you haven't seen a ton of running from Drew Aller, but like in that game, he did run the ball a fair amount. You're right. They just had no answers for it. I was very surprised that the linebacking core, especially in that Penn State game, struggled the way they did. And I look at Penn State, or Ohio State, I should say, in personnel wise, they're probably in a little bit better position to attack that. Now, again, Dan Lanning's now had a couple weeks to digest what happened, hopefully make his correct. But to me, I still think you're getting the best version of this Ohio State team when Will Howard's running the ball. They're being very varied in their run scheme. And then the ball is getting out of his hand quickly, because that's still, you talk about questions in this game. Ohio State's only real question is that offensive line, and can they hold up against two extremely good interior defensive tackles like they struggled to against Michigan, but also probably a slightly better edge group possibly in this Oregon team.
And you're going to get Jordan Burch back in this football game. Like, I think we forget Jordan Burch wasn't playing in this game 2 months ago. I'm with you. If you're Ohio State, it's check down this depth chart. The offensive line is the question mark. Let's go to X Factor.
But Ohio State, like that I don't want to like just say like they have enough players on the boundary to kind of keep that at bay a little bit when they're playing on rhythm and getting the ball out there and the ball's not staying in their hands, and they're possessing it a fair amount. Like
that's a really good point.
To pretty much control the clock for the whole first half, I should say, against Tennessee, I think did a good job of wearing out a really aggressive D-line. I look at Oregon, they don't rotate a ton in their own right, especially not in the middle. Like Jamari Caldwell and Harmon play pretty much the whole game. It feels like Penn State wore them out. Be interesting to see if Ohio State can possess the ball.
That game got into a little bit of a track meet, that Oregon-Penn State game. Penn State was running tempo. You could tell, because you're right. It's Derek Harmon, Jamari Caldwell. They both played over 55 snaps. That's a lot of snaps for some big dogs up front. And really, Amari Washington's the only guy that kind of gets mixed in routinely. Can you run some tempo? Can you get to the depth of this Oregon defensive line? Because you just saw Penn State do that. Yeah, I'm with you. I think that's huge. All right, X factor in this football game. This is probably my favorite conversation to have. Everyone's going to talk about Jeremiah Smith, Mecca Buka, Travion Henderson, Quinshaw Judkins, Will Howard. Same thing for Dylan Gabriel, Tez Johnson, the laundry list of guys. Dill, for Ohio State, the broadcast might not talk about him. The national media might not talk about him leading into this football game. Who are the X factors for this Ohio State football team?
I think it's going to be the tight end position. I look at a position that doesn't feel like it's totally been used a ton in these past couple of years. I look at a game in Tennessee. I thought using those tight ends a little bit more in that game, whether it was Kamarasek, whether it was G. Scott, both I thought blocked really well, which obviously is probably their priority one, being able to block on the perimeter. So those two guys, I think their ability to get a little bit more involved and be featured in this offense, but also continue to do the dirty work, I think it's going to be a very interesting storyline.
The dirty work. That's probably what I'm more concerned with. Like, how is G. Scott blocking on the perimeter? Because you've seen him.
In my opinion, you need to still be a threat with the ball. Like, you need to be
G. Scott is. I mean, G. Scott's that.
I guess he can do it.
I agree. G. Scott's that guy. We know he can pass catch. I think he's made some strides in the blocking department.
Great effort against Tennessee for sure. He looked awesome, I thought.
I'm gonna go with the same position for Oregon, Kenny Sadiq. Not even the starting tight end. I'm gonna go to the tight end 2 here. Kenny Sadiq had 0 catches, 0 targets in that football game, their first matchup. This is a guy that, especially with Oregon coming off like almost 3 weeks, like they gotta have something for Kenny. So there are just things Kenny and Sadiq can do that nobody else can really do for Oregon. He's probably one of, if not the fastest player on offense for Oregon. He also goes 245 pounds. It's the definition of a matchup nightmare, with so much attention potentially going to not only Tez, but also after what Evan Stewart did in the first go around to Evan Stewart as well. Can you get Kenyon Sadiq involved is probably the number one thing I'm looking at.
Because I think if you're Oregon, you're still kind of looking for that fourth option in the passing attack, where Trayshawn Holden's had some moments where he's played really well. I mean, you clearly have your three. You're Evan Stewart, Tez, and obviously Terrence Ferguson. Like, those guys are eating up the lion's share of the targets, but I still think you're looking for who's going to be that fourth guy. Now, there is that element.
I don't even know if that's where I'm going, though. I think I'm just going with, like, there's going to be 1 or 2 plays that are going to determine the outcome. And I think Kenyon Sadiq can come up with one of those. I'm going to give you one for Ohio State, too, and that's Carnell Tate. What has made Ohio State, and I'm a Michigan fan, like, speaking from experience here, the amount of firepower that Ohio State has, you're just able to find your matchup. And there's so much attention to Jeremiah Smith. There's so much attention to Emeka Buka, and there's no secret that they're going to be the two that are kind of running this passing attack. Carnell Tate is a wide receiver 1 on probably 85% of college football teams across the country. You know, as a Michigan fan, Carnell Tate head and shoulders wide receiver 1 for that Michigan team. He's really good. And can he, like Jabbar Muhammad, Jeremiah Smith, they're going to go to battle. You probably say the same thing for Brandon Johnson and Emeka at the Nick.
Well, because you probably like the boundary position in the secondary a little bit better than you do the safety nickel spot. Like, Tycheem Johnson certainly played good ball. But, like, I still think that, to me, is probably your bigger question, is that middle of the defense, especially in the passing attack. Now, it's not like a huge question. Like, you're certainly splitting some hairs, but you're elite on the boundary, I think, if you're Oregon. That, to me, is like, can you get some good matchups on those safeties and on that nickel spot and make some things happen with a guy like Carnell Tate, who, again, certainly doesn't get all the attention, but is highly capable of making things happen.
Yeah, I feel like that's kind of what it's going to come down to. You're obviously going to have your big dogs making plays, but there's a lot of really good players that can impact this football game. We'll sign out here. Probably talk about this game a time or two before it kicks off on New Year's. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.